Buenas tardes. Esta tarde vamos a tratar un tema muy actual y de interés para todo tipo de público. Un tema que hemos incluido en la estrategia de diplomacia científica del Instituto Cultural Rumano, con el objetivo de entender mejor las políticas estatales y el cómo han decidido algunos de los países europeos disponer de la capacidad de desarrollar y producir vacunas vitales para la salud pública. Tal y como se presenta en el libro al cual nos referimos esta tarde, las políticas han sido diferentes, en contextos diferentes y con consecuencias diferentes para la actitud y la confianza de los ciudadanos. En este periodo, la pandemia del COVID-19, que nos ha cambiado la vida y la percepción del mundo, creo que ha perdido un poco el papel de protagonista en la cobertura informativa, los mensajes gubernamentales y en las preocupaciones cotidianas. Se ha convertido como en el telón de fondo de nuestras sociedades. Pero nos preocupa que vuelven a subir los casos, aparecen secuelas, variantes y subvariantes. Seguimos aprendiendo y con responsabilidad luchamos siempre para superar la pandemia. Pues en este evento, organizado junto a la Embajada de Rumanía en el Reino de España, estamos muy honrados y agradecidos a nuestros ponentes por haber aceptado el compartir con nosotros algo que es el resultado de largas y rigurosas investigaciones sobre cómo se han cimentado muchas respuestas nacionales al problema. Aprenderemos así cuáles han sido los factores que han influido estas decisiones gubernamentales. La pandemia ha abierto el campo a varios retos y uno de estos ha sido volver a poner el foco en la historia y presentar distintos estudios de casos, tal y como lo han hecho un grupo de expertos coordinados por el profesor Stuart Blume y Baylac-Paouly, que han editado un volumen publicado por la prestigiosa editorial británica Reflexiones, basado en la experiencia de los institutos nacionales de vacunas de 8 países: Croacia, India, Irán, Holanda, Rumanía, Serbia, España y Suecia. Pues 4 de los autores que firman artículos en este libro están aquí con nosotros y expondrán el caso del país que han estudiado junto a, creo, reflexiones más generales. Se trata de los profesores Stuart Blume, la profesora Maria Floarea Pop, la doctora Vesna Trifunovic y el doctor Valentín Veron-Toma. Gracias, distinguidos profesores, por la iniciativa de organizar juntos este acto. Permítanme presentarlos brevemente. El Dr. Stuart Blume es coautor y editor del libro, es profesor emérito del Departamento de Antropología de la Universidad de Ámsterdam, ha sido asesor de bioética en la World Federation of the Deaf, profesor en la Universidad de Oslo y fellow Prometeo en la Universidad de Baylac en Ecuador. La profesora Maria Floarea es catedrática de Historia de la Ciencia de la Facultad de Medicina de Ciudad Real en la Universidad de Castilla-La Mancha, miembro del Centro Regional de Investigación Biomédica y directora del Grupo de Investigación Salud, Historia y Sociedad. Ha sido profesora invitada por Emory University en Estados Unidos, Universidad de Geneva e Instituto Interuniversitario López Piñero de Valencia. La doctora Vesna Trifunovic, investigadora asociada al Instituto de Etnografía y de Academia de las Ciencias y Artes de Serbia. Su área de investigación es la antropología de la medicina y de la salud pública, con foco en las vacunas y la vacunación. El doctor Valentín Veron-Toma es investigador senior en el Instituto de Antropología Ucrania de la Academia Rumana de Bucarest, antropólogo médico, jefe del Departamento de Antropología Cultural y Social del Instituto de Antropología. Sus áreas de investigación son la antropología médica, psiquiatría cultural y la historia médica. En julio de 2020 ha sido ponente en un acto en línea, No More Pandemics, Disease Prevention and Control Summit America 2020, hablando de la importancia de la producción local de la vacuna en el contexto de la pandemia de COVID-19 y del problema del acceso equitativo a la vacuna en los países en desarrollo. Pues, profesor Blume, le cedo la palabra para contarnos los objetivos del libro y cuál ha sido la estrategia nacional de Holanda.
Sí, muchas gracias por la invitación a la hospitalidad y me disculpe, no puedo dar el pequeño discurso en español. Mi español no es suficiente. Bueno, voy a hablar en inglés. Where do all the vaccines we use to vaccinate all the children, millions of doses of vaccines, where do they come from? Does anybody care? I think a few years ago, if you would have asked professionals in public health where the vaccines come from, and does it matter, most people would have said, it doesn't matter. As long as they work and they're safe, we don't care where they come from. But I think that's changing. I know it's changing. So where do they come from? From the beginnings of vaccination in Europe, after the First World War, more or less, right until in some countries, the 1980s, you see that some countries in Europe and outside Europe, in Europe, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, all the vaccines came from private industry. But in many countries, including those of Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, later the countries that were part of the socialist bloc, and a slightly more complicated story in Spain, vaccines were produced in the public sector in institutes dependent in some way on ministries of health. And they tended, in these countries, the Netherlands was also such a country where most of the vaccines came from an institute, a public sector institute, dependent on the Ministry of Health. And largely, in the 1950s, 1960s, even 1970s, there was easy collaboration between public sector institutes making vaccines and pharmaceutical companies. It all began to change. No, I should have said something else. Because in those years, there was very little patent protection in the field of vaccines. That's where Jonas Salk, who discovered the first polio vaccine, said, you can't patent the sum. Vaccines he saw as so vital for public health, they had to be a public, what we would now call a public good. It was wrong to patent them, and he didn't want any patents. In the 1960s, 50s and 60s in Europe, West and Eastern blocs had slightly different ideas about public health. Politicians did, because politicians in East and West saw success in public health as somehow demonstrating the superiority of one or other ideological system. But the scientists collaborated easily. When we had the eradication of smallpox campaign, Americans and Russians and all of us in between, all people collaborated. The scientists collaborated, the politicians were looking to make ideological capital, diplomatic capital out of success. it played out particularly visibly in Germany because of the division. In the 1980s, the vaccine system internationally, globally, began to change. As I see it, for three interrelated reasons. One was the triumph of neoliberal economics, the idea of knowledge becoming property. What had been before knowledge was turned into what we now call intellectual property. The concept of intellectual property didn't exist in the vaccines field before. There was knowledge to be shared, but that changed. The second thing was new technology. New ways of making vaccines were being developed, dependent on making use of genetic manipulations and all kinds of things that we've seen a lot of with recent COVID vaccines. But this knowledge was not. So who had that knowledge? Who knew how to manipulate genes and make vaccines? Not public health scientists, not even the scientists in the big manufacturing companies. It was mostly scientists, and mostly in the United States, but not all, working in universities who, in the climate of those times, took their knowledge and set up little companies that we now call spin-off companies or biotech companies. And all they had was their knowledge. They didn't make anything. They didn't have anything to sell except knowledge. And that's why every little bit of knowledge became protected by patents. There was no more free exchange of knowledge because it wasn't knowledge anymore. It was intellectual property to be sold. And the little biotech companies tried in selling their knowledge and their expertise to big pharmaceutical corporations. We've seen recent examples of that with BioNTech in Germany and Pfizer in the United States. And the third factor which changed dramatically at that time was, of course, globalization. Markets were coming global. And specifically, as far as vaccines were concerned, and this was a perspective that also the World Health Organization was putting out, institutions that made vaccines had to be seen in terms of their contribution to a global supply system. So a national vaccine producer was no longer to be seen, they said, as something that would enable a country to meet its vaccine needs. No, they were to be seen as one element in a global system of production and supply. And all of these factors together meant that countries, in most countries of the world, that still had, in the 1990s, still had public sector vaccine institutions, began to sell them. The situation in Spain, of course, was different. It's a somewhat different history, as Maria Isabel will explain, but that had to do with the legacy of Franquismo, the dictadura. But in East and West, but the stories were not exactly the same, as we will hear soon. In Western Europe, in the Netherlands, for example, in Sweden, the Nordic countries, perhaps more influenced by neoliberal thinking. There was no apparent difficulty in saying, okay, we don't need this facility anymore, we sell it. So, and the Danes and the Norwegians, the Swedes and the Dutch and the Australians and some others, they sold their institutes. In Eastern Europe, as you will hear from Vesna and Valentin, it was a somewhat different story. They were also, well, I'm not saying what they will explain. The point is that there were forces that were acting on this global system, but they expressed themselves somewhat differently in different countries. And what this book attempts to do is to show that how these forces express themselves, the way in which local traditions, political configurations, and traditions and practices meant that similar things were happening, but they were not exactly the same. In that book, but not represented here, were two countries that followed a different route, although for different reasons. One is India, which is a complicated story, partly because of the extreme nationalism of the present government. And the other country treated in there was Iran, which now actually very interesting collaboration with Cuba, two countries that are been excluded from the global system because of sanctions. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. So I think all I wanted to say was, what this shows is the impact of global forces, but expressing them, and this is a very anthropological perspective, of course, expressing themselves differently in different countries because of national traditions and ideologies and institutions. So I think that's enough from me, and you'll be happy, I think, to hear that the next speaker will be speaking in Spanish.
Pues muchas gracias, ¿no?, por haber organizado esta actividad y haberme invitado. A ver, el caso de España, lo que hemos trabajado en el capítulo es un poco cómo se crearon esas instituciones para producir y aplicar la vacuna, que era con carácter estatal, y cómo después pues, cayeron, ¿no?, desaparecieron. Y eso ocurrió entre 1871 y 1986. España había recibido bien, había introducido bien la vacuna contra la viruela a finales del siglo XVIII, entonces entre 1799 y 1803 se difundió muy bien la vacuna, se empezó a producir, a aplicar, pero luego se produjo un retroceso que duró prácticamente todo el siglo XIX y, digamos, las cosas empezaron a cambiar a partir de 1871. En ese momento se va a crear el primer Instituto Nacional de Vacunación con la intención de promover la vacunación contra la viruela, que no era fácil de lograr, y también de producir la vacuna. Esta iniciativa, que aparentemente podía ser sencilla, pues sin embargo fue un largo camino hasta que eso verdaderamente se materializó. Y, digamos, esa situación se mantuvo a lo largo de esos más de 100 años que estudiamos en el capítulo. Con momentos de aceleración, de poder hacer, producirse instituciones y desarrollarse bien, y otros momentos que se para, en ahí prácticamente es así. Una de las características es que España dependió bastante de lo que se estaba haciendo a nivel internacional y de incluso la ayuda de organizaciones internacionales como la Fundación Rockefeller, con anterioridad a la Guerra Civil Española, y luego, después de la Guerra Civil, pues la OMS. Entonces, bueno, eso ahora comentaré un poco más. Luego, otra de las características es que muchas veces estas instituciones diversas que se crearon, sobre todo a finales del siglo XIX, era como respuesta a, por ejemplo, cuando ya se demuestra que el suero antidifterico era un buen recurso para tratar la difteria. Entonces, en 1894 eso se presenta en un congreso de demografía y ahí, y en España se crea un instituto, el Instituto Nacional de Higiene y Bacteriología. pero nunca llegó a funcionar. Entonces, ya he mencionado dos instituciones que realmente tuvieron poco recorrido o ninguno como esta segunda. Cuando se pierden las colonias, Cuba, Filipinas, etc., en este 1898, como con la intención un poco de regenerar el país y compensar esa situación política, el Instituto de Higiene Militar se va a crear. Cuando la peste amenazaba en 1899, estaba en Oporto, entonces aquí se aprovecha, diríamos, ese tirón para esa institución de 1894 que no se había puesto en marcha, para, junto con la primera que les he dicho, de 1871, hacer una nueva, el Instituto Nacional de Higiene de Alfonso XIII, en 1899, que este sí va a tener un recorrido hasta la Guerra Civil y va a realmente, con dificultades, con momentos donde tiene más recursos y más personal y otros menos, pues va a ir haciendo su labor en ese ámbito de la investigación sobre vacunas, producción y aplicación. Después de la Guerra Civil, pues también fueron otras epidemias, las de poliomielitis, las que contribuyeron a que se pudiera renovar las instituciones y se ampliara el servicio de virología de la Escuela Nacional de Sanidad, e incluso a que se creara un nuevo centro, eso fue al inicio de los 60, ya que se creara un nuevo centro, el Centro Nacional de Virología y Ecología Sanitarias, Embajada de Madrid, que se inauguró en 1968. Entonces, bueno, ¿por qué, digamos, esta situación de varias instituciones y a pesar de eso dificultad, pues para tener una financiación adecuada y mantenida, un personal también bien formado, con dedicación a tiempo completo? Pues cuando venían los consultores de esas instituciones y organizaciones internacionales, de misma la Rockefeller que luego con la OMS, pues resulta que una de las cosas que señalaban era que había falta de voluntad política. Es que en determinados momentos se podía tener incluso un equipamiento moderno, pero no había quien lo pudiera manejar bien o no había horas suficientes. Entonces, digamos, eso es un poco parte del problema. Otra parte del problema para crear esas instituciones, o sea, para que esas instituciones, tanto para crearlas como para que funcionaran, fue la lucha de intereses entre profesionales sanitarios, médicos, distintos grupos de médicos, entre médicos y farmacéuticos, y médicos, farmacéuticos y veterinarios, y también entre sanidad civil y sanidad militar. Entonces, todo eso, pues la verdad es que junto con momentos igual más complicados, con menos recursos, la inestabilidad política también, tuvimos antes de la guerra civil momentos también de bastante inestabilidad política y alguna dictadura y finales del siglo XIX, o sea, ese también es otro de los factores. Podemos decir que con ese Instituto Nacional de Higiene de Alfonso XIII, pues más o menos se logra que en el ámbito público se produjera las vacunas y pudiéramos ser más o menos competitivos cuando ya llega el periodo de la Segunda República, o sea, 1932, a Guerra Civil. ¿Qué pasa? O sea, ¿cómo se podía conseguir tener las vacunas suficientes para vacunar y sobre todo cuando había epidemias? Pues con el apoyo también de la producción a veces del Instituto de Higiene Militar, que además de atender las necesidades militares, pues proporcionaba esas vacunas para brotes, sobre todo, que aparecían un poco graves, y luego con apoyo de algunos laboratorios privados, incluso algunos laboratorios privados que se van a crear a partir de 1919 por parte de esos médicos y científicos que estaban trabajando en el Instituto Nacional de Higiene, pero que ante la dificultad y ver los problemas que entrañaba allí poder llegar a hacer la producción, pues decidieron crearlo a nivel privado para ver si de esta manera podía ser más ágil. Entonces, bueno, eso es una colaboración. La manera de conseguir personal que estuviera bien formado fue primero con la Fundación Rockefeller y las becas que les proporcionaba para los investigadores españoles para que se fueran a formar fuera, Estados Unidos, en el Instituto Pasteur o en el COP, o sea, los principales centros. Y después de la Guerra Civil, cuando es el periodo franquista, de la dictadura franquista, es por medio de los convenios, los programas país con la OMS. A ver, el caso de España también lo que muestra es como cuando se había logrado ya, digamos, un nivel bastante aceptable en este ámbito de producción de vacunas y la investigación, incluso no solo en bacteriología, sino en biología, llega la Guerra Civil y tiene un impacto muy negativo. No solo porque las infraestructuras se destruyeran, como en este Instituto Nacional de Alfonso XIII, sino también porque la mayoría de esas élites científicas bien formadas tuvieron que exiliarse o, si se quedaron aquí, fueron objeto de depuración. Entonces, lo que va a hacer el régimen franquista es sacar personas nuevas, una figura, por ejemplo, Florencio Pérez Gallardo, al que se le va a promocionar porque era una persona bastante afín al régimen. Mientras que antes de la Guerra Civil había centros en Valencia, en Barcelona y en Madrid, después de la Guerra Civil, con estas ayudas de la OMS, lo que se promueve es solo que la investigación básicamente se desarrollara en Madrid y la producción de vacunas solo se llegó a hacer, la producción pública, en Madrid. La investigación en Valencia y en Barcelona lograron, pero digamos un poco buscando sus vías, pero no porque la ayuda viniera del régimen, sino por sus contactos lograron apoyo. Entonces, a ver, se pudo producir a nivel público algunas vacunas, pero las, digamos, para infecciones virales como poliomielitis, sarampión, rubeola, goteras, nunca se produjeron en nuestro país con el sistema público. Fueron la única así contravirus que se produjo fue, digo, durante el periodo después de franquista, fue contra la rabia, contra la gripe, pero algo más que contra la viruela. Y para eso se creó ahí en ese nuevo edificio en Majadahonda un centro piloto para que pudiera seguir las condiciones. Entonces, en ese marco general que antes ha explicado el profesor Blume, en los años 80, ¿no?, de ese cambio, que también coincidió con esa erradicación de la viruela, pues aquí se aprovecha que ya no hay que vacunar contra la viruela, no hay por tanto que producir vacunas contra la viruela para cerrar ese centro de producción de vacunas aquí en Madrid y ya depender solo a nivel privado. Pero dentro del proceso de cambio también que he indicado de producción de las vacunas, de que era algo más complejo, y también de las compañías farmacéuticas que se fueron fusionando, pues hubo un momento en que también, como a los años 90, desaparecieron las compañías farmacéuticas privadas que había en España y nos quedamos sin producción. Entonces, con motivo, por ejemplo, del SARS en 2003, se intentó volver a ver si alguno de los laboratorios privados se podía hacer una colaboración público-privado. Con motivo de la pandemia de gripe de 2009-10, otra vez lo mismo, con otro laboratorio, y también no ha tenido éxito. Y cuando llegó la COVID-19, pues entonces se puso de relieve que, por ejemplo, algunos grupos que habían hecho investigación en coronavirus como 20 o 25 años antes, debieron pararlas por falta de financiación. Entonces, aunque empezaron a trabajar para poner a punto, pues claro, el camino que han tenido que recorrer ha sido muy complicado, y a día de hoy pues, no tenemos vacuna de producción española, mientras que otros países pues, sí han tenido esa capacidad de revertir la situación. Entonces, yo creo que esto que ha ocurrido con lo de vacuna contra el coronavirus, ¿no? Pues resume bien un poco nuestra situación, ¿no? Es a nivel público insuficiente, apoyo de higiene militar y apoyo de laboratorios privados, pero no algo verdaderamente muy bien establecido y mantenido. Y eso es lo que quería comentar. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a usted. Let's go further and see with Professor Lesnar what are the cultural, political, social determinants in the production in Serbia.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation and for having us here. I'm sorry, but I will be speaking in English also. My Spanish is not that good. So, the title of my chapter is Vaccine Production in Serbia, Political and Sociocultural Determinants in a Historical Perspective. So, my aim was to look into the role of local context in the development of public sector vaccine production, with the assumption that since the state institutes are usually under the direct government control, they are likely to be affected by the interaction of local socio-political occurrences with global demands and developments in the production of vaccines. So the aim was to demonstrate the role of specific political, social and cultural influences in the achievements and weaknesses of vaccine production in the public sector. And to that end, the chapter provides a case study of vaccine production in Serbia in different historical periods, which were characterized by different socio-political regimes and systems. So the history of public sector vaccine production in Serbia stretches from the very beginning of the 20th century and practically up until now. And throughout that period, vaccines have been manufactured in radically different socio-political systems. And these include the pre-Second World War monarchist system, then the post-Second World War socialist system, which was followed by the process of post-socialist transformation, which began more or less in the 1990s. So the succession of those different systems with their specific ideological backgrounds provided basis for exploring the effects of different political, economic, and sociocultural forces on organization and conceptions of public sector vaccine production. So my assumption was that social organization and conceptualization of vaccine production were related, and that they were significantly shaped by local context and its transformations. So the chapter is divided into three main sections, each dealing with one of those historical periods. And the aim in the first section was to demonstrate how local vaccine production was established in the last decades of the 19th century. And it explores the interaction of political, economic, and sociocultural determinants that led to the founding of the first Pasteur Institute in the country. So special focus was on the first ideas, arguments, and motives for launching that production. The next two sections deal with the organization of vaccine production at the Torlak Institute, which became the main vaccine manufacturer in the country. That vaccine production developed in the socialist and post-socialist periods. So both sections also consider the changing motives and discourses about national vaccine production that emerged in relation to specific circumstances in socialist and post-socialist contexts. Well, my conclusion was basically that beside meeting public health needs, an important characteristic of vaccine production in the public sector is that it can be also used as an instrument for fulfilling certain ideological functions and broader socio-political goals. And precisely that could be the source of both achievements and weaknesses of state-organized vaccine production. So, for instance, the first section demonstrated how ideological views led to the establishment of a national manufacturing institute, despite many structural difficulties of that time. But first, these views opposed the possibility of private ownership. So vaccine production was placed under the state jurisdiction. Apparently, the dominant opinion of some initiators of local production was that private manufacturers were primarily guided by economic interests, and that to ensure quality and efficacy and safety, the production had to be placed under the state's supervision and regulation. Similarly, organizing production was not only motivated by pragmatic and economic reasons, but also by broader political ideas. And one of those was the aim to demonstrate the country's progressiveness and independence. So the establishment of local vaccine production was also motivated by political aspirations towards creating the reputation of a modern country, and towards countering some negative cultural connotations that Western societies broadly ascribed to the emerging nations of the 19th century Balkans. So the founding of a national vaccine institute was considered as an important step in improving the country's international reputation, status, and also as an act of identification with progressive Western societies. Then following the end of the Second World War, there was a radical socio-economic and political change based on communist doctrine, and this led, of course, to the end of the monarchist system. And specific features of this entirely different socio-political context also reflected on future developments in the field of local vaccine production. So during the socialist period, vaccine production was intensified and significantly improved, and this served for the then regime to demonstrate the rapid social development and modernization which were taking place in the established socialist system. And specific favorable socio-political circumstances of that time stimulated mass production of vaccines, especially of polio vaccine, which became very famous and was exported throughout the world. So in this period, the competition for international prestige became an important ideological motivator of local vaccine production, especially during the 1960s and early 1970s. And those achievements implied that the country was now equal with the developed world. And consequently, it was in that period that the Torlak Institute became an important national symbol of success and authority in the field of public health, so mainly owing to the production of vaccines and especially to the production of polio vaccine. Then weaknesses subsequently emerged during the late socialist period, and they were more or less related to the lack of incentives for improvements, which practically came from transformations in the socialist system. So in the late socialist period, the motives for vaccine production changed. Instead of competition for international prestige, the motives became purely financial, which was associated with new economic developments of that time and new cultural orientations in the country. So I will just briefly reflect on the on the late phase of post-socialist transformation, which began in 2000 and practically led to a greater exposure to global trends and demands, but also to neoliberal influences. So starting from 2000, Serbia took a course in foreign policy that involved, among other things, the candidacy for the EU membership. And therefore, the pressure to comply with international standards and trends became greater, especially in vaccine production. So internal policy was aimed practically at catching up with global neoliberal developments, which implied the promotion of market economy, competition, economic efficiency, promotion of private sector, of course. And in line with such political and ideological turn, the state's policy with respect to vaccine production was mainly oriented towards implementing global requirements and practically leaving the national manufacturer entirely exposed to those external influences. And all this led to significant decline of the national manufacturer and of local vaccine production. So in this period, there seemed to be no ideological grounds for a long-term government commitment to financially support the national manufacturer. And the new neoliberal agenda implied actually that the state-owned institutes were generally seen as part of obsolete socialist system, and they were either to be closed down or privatized. They were not considered worthy of investment. So, in other words, in post-socialist context, there was a commitment to breaking both ideologically and practically with previous system and its symbols. And this, of course, reflected very negatively on the public sector vaccine production. During the COVID pandemic, there seemed to be a turning point in rethinking the importance of local vaccine production. So the global race to acquire vaccines and their shortages provided new ideological and political grounds for the current Serbian government to engage in establishing local production of the COVID-19 vaccines. So in this period, the discourse of vaccine self-sufficiency re-emerged in official statements. Also, the motives of economic gain and prestige reappeared. So there were announcements that Serbia would be the first European country to produce Russian Sputnik vaccine and also Chinese Sinopharm vaccine and supply the whole region with them. But as global supply of vaccines stabilized over time, these promises and statements practically waned over time. So the bottom line is that we need to consider these specific local political and social and cultural influences in assessing the fate and feasibility of public sector vaccine manufacturers now. So yeah, I'll stop here.
And let's see now what's the Romanian case in vaccine production.
Well,
Dr. Valentin
in España.
No, but I understand.
English. Okay.
Yeah. So, first of all, I would like to thank the Romanian Embassy in Spain and the Romanian Cultural Institute for having us here and for organizing this wonderful workshop dedicated to wonderful collaboration between Professor Stuart Blume from Amsterdam and colleagues from Spain, Romania, Serbia, Iran, and some other countries. So this is a project that brings empirical evidence to a very important debate on the role of the state in producing new vaccines, and the effect of the globalization trends in recent times, before the pandemic and during the pandemic. So this book will bring some important historical and anthropological evidence to support arguments in favor of states being again important in strategies for the benefit of their populations and for the benefit of research in the future. What I want to present you this evening is something about the strategic role of the Romanian state in the production and distribution of vaccines through Public Vaccine Institute, and to say something about my contribution to the book, a case study on Ion Cantacuzino institutions, the first one created in 1901 and the second one, the prestigious Institute of Vaccines and Serum, created in 1921. So my case study was entitled Translating Pasteur's Vision in Eastern Europe, the role of the Cantacuzino Institute in Romanian vaccination policies and vaccine production. And it focused on the evolution of applied research and domestic vaccine production in Romania. Although the first systematic studies on vaccines began in 1887, with the establishment of the first bacteriology institute under the leadership of Victor Babeș, and research and production of vaccines was conducted in several institutes in Romania. This study focused on vaccine production in two medical research institutions created by Professor Ioan Cantacuzino on the model of the Pasteur Institute in Paris, the Laboratory of Experimental Medicine, and the Institute of Serums and Vaccines, Dr. Cantacuzino, which I would refer as Cantacuzino Institute. The paradox of Romania's current situation during the pandemic. Well, without sufficient research infrastructure and lacking competitive production infrastructure, Romania is currently behaving on the world market like a country that has never had the capacity to produce the vaccines it needs. However, this is not the case. In fact, Romania has a long history of scientific research in the field of vaccines, from the first studies on the rabies vaccine from 1887-1888 to the last pandemic influenza vaccine in 2009, a long history of domestic vaccine production starting from 1888 until 2013, and I'm referring here only to the Pasteurian tradition because we have a previous Jennerian tradition starting from 1800s, similar tradition with other countries like Germany or Austria or Spain. So I'm only referring to Pasteur's tradition of creating vaccines in public sector institutes. So it started in 1887 and it lasted until 2013. And we had a National Vaccine Production Institute with 100 years history from 1921 to 2022. And it has made important contribution to the eradication or control of epidemics at the national, European and global levels. How is it possible that this significant achievement have for the most part been consigned to history? What were the main factors that contributed to the increase and later to the decrease of the country's capacity to discover, to produce and develop vaccines locally for the needs of its population? I started with these questions because I wanted to answer why now we have difficulties and what happened with all that history of, building skills and infrastructure, and I wouldn't have easy answers. I needed to dig deeper into archival materials, discuss with people involved in research, doing field work, so trying to understand what happened in the last 30 years of apparent decline. The purpose of the chapter was twofold. First, to describe the way in which the Romanian state built the research and production infrastructure, how it established a monopoly, and how it imposed itself internationally as an active country in combating epidemics and pandemics and in eradication by vaccination of certain diseases. In order to understand the evolution of vaccine research and production, I described the important contribution of Professor Ioan Cantacuzino, the positioning strategy of the National Institute for the Production of Sera and Vaccines at national and international level, and I have described some elements of continuity that have allowed the Institute he founded to continue to research and produce vaccines for an increasing number of diseases after Cantacuzino's death in 1934. In this way, for instance, in the years 1974-1990, all the vaccines from the expanded program on immunization, EPI, were produced locally, which was quite an achievement. The second purpose of the chapter was to describe the evolution of the Institute after the change of political regime in 1990, when Romania adopted the principles of the market economy. In this sense, I highlighted some of the essential factors that contributed to the reduction of research capacity and to the progressive degradation of the production infrastructure for local vaccines. Finally, the measure of transfer in 2017 of the Cantacuzino Institute from various ministries to the Ministry of Defense was mentioned in order to resume the local production of vaccines, but against the background of a continuous withdrawal of the neoliberal state, as Vesna mentioned, the same here, from funding research and production of domestic vaccines. The central argument of the chapter was that the internal factors, for instance political, economic and institutional, to which are added the external factors, international pressures, led to the elimination of the Cantacuzino Institute from the vaccine market, making Romania totally dependent on the big transnational pharmaceutical companies. The transfer of knowledge, which took place at the beginning of the 20th century from the Pasteur Institute in Paris to the Laboratory of Experimental Medicine, and later to the Institute of Hacer and Vaccines, allowed Romania to become one of the countries most advanced in the field of infectious diseases through the administration of local vaccines. The progressive scaling of local production, starting with 1912 and the successes of vaccination campaigns in the midst of the epidemic outbreak in 1913, positioned Romania as an important partner of the Pasteur Institute in its strategy to fight on a large scale internationally against epidemics and pandemics. The close relationship between Cantacuzino and his team with Pasteur Institutes on various continents, not only Paris, as well as the involvement of researchers from the Cantacuzino Institute from the very beginning in the activity of the United Nations League and later in the World Health Organization, allowed Romania to adopt international standards, implement anti-epidemic control, and contribute for decades to combating and even eradicating certain diseases. As I mentioned before, until 1989, Romania produced locally all the vaccines required by the World Health Organization in the EPI scheme. Self-sufficiency, as also happened in other countries, has been achieved in domestic human vaccine production. After 1990, however, with the change of political regime, the monopoly position of the Institute became impossible to maintain. At present, although the Cantacuzino Institute still exists, it no longer produces vaccines for the local population. The last vaccines on the market were influenza vaccines. They were produced in 2013 with great effort, although in 2009, during the swine flu pandemic, the World Health Organization designated the Cantacuzino Institute as one of the strategic producers globally of the pandemic vaccine. And the Institute specialists were able to market the vaccine called CantGrip, whose efficacy and safety have been demonstrated by experimental studies. During the COVID pandemic, however, Romania preferred to buy a certain amount of vaccines from a small number of private pharmaceutical companies and purchase them through common mechanisms at European level instead of investing in the infrastructure needed to produce its own vaccines, as it is done so in other epidemics and in its long institutional history. Things are now changing because many countries are discussing that they need to reconsider their own strategies in terms of public health. So this idea is not far-fetched that Romania can have a new leadership position on the global market, but it needs time, investment and vision, and of course collaboration internationally. So I think our book will convey this message that the pandemic created the need for a new debate on who's best placed to do research and distribute vaccines with high levels of efficacy and safety for local populations and also to cover the needs of a global market. Thank you very much for being with us here tonight and to discuss these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, to reconnect with what Thomas said, I just wanted to ask you what are some of the lessons learned from the pandemic, and if there is, as he said, any possibility of a common strategy in vaccine production at European level or at a larger scale. What do you think?
It would be nice, but I think one of the problems that we don't get at really in this book, because it's not a national issue, but is the way in which in the last 2 years, 3 years, the authority of the World Health Organization has been undermined. Part of the problem, I think, is that public health, and it goes back earlier than the pandemic, but public health, I think over the last 10 years, has increasingly been seen as too important for ministers of health. It's been securitized, that's the word that my political scientist friends use. So you see more and more talk of public health as an element in protecting the nation's security. And there have been lots and lots of discussions about the security aspects of public health. And we see it in what happened. I mean, how did the global community deal with the pandemic? With difficulty. I mean, the Western nations, with the initial exception of the United States, which kept out, we set up COVAX. I think most people agree that COVAX was not a success. It didn't succeed in obtaining the vaccines that it promised, but that was partly because Western governments undermined it by buying up the supplies themselves. So they gave money to COVAX, but they bought the vaccines that it would have used the money to purchase to give to poor countries. And also, critics have argued that COVAX failed also because it was based too much on a market model. It didn't try to intervene in producing vaccines, but only in supporting purchase of vaccines from existing commercial producers. I think this is exactly the point, one of the important questions is going to be, how can we learn from that? Does anybody want to learn from that? Because what we saw is also global institutions were partly undermined, but also because of the security aspect or because of the strategic importance. I mean, we saw something emerging that was most like the race to get into space in the 1960s and 70s. And in the beginning of the pandemic, and it's discussed in an epilogue in that book, there was a real race, especially between the United States and China and one or two European countries trying to run behind to be the first to produce a vaccine. So I think the important question is going to be, for the future, is because we know this is not the last pandemic. Most people in epidemiology and public health expect there'll be a new wave of the coronavirus, but there'll be many more. There are thousands of viruses sitting out there in the jungle waiting to jump into a human and find a new world of place to live in. There'll be more. So how is there a political will to develop this collective global system? It doesn't look like. It looks at the moment like it's become too important a source of strategic and commercial benefit. And my own sense is that, yes, I think there is talk of revitalizing state sector institutes, but we know that state sector institutes are no longer necessarily instruments of public health. They might just as well be instruments of foreign policy. I think we've seen that in our neighbors to the east and to the much further east. Okay. So my skeptical answer.
Somebody else wants to deal with that?
I guess we agree with Stuart on this.